Okay, let's really unpack this. Imagine, just for a second, you wake up, grab your phone like you do every morning, and
Yeah.
nothing. Your digital world, those platforms you're on every single day, Facebook, Instagram, check in YouTube, maybe a quick look at X, suddenly dot blank, inaccessible. Your feed, gone. Stories, vanished. Tutorials you needed. Updates from friends, even how you run your business online, just silenced. That's exactly what millions of people in Nepal woke up to on September 4th, 2025. And it wasn't a tech glitch. It was deliberate, nationwide. And look, this isn't just some, minor local news item from halfway across the world. This is actually a really important deep dive into something huge happening globally. It's about this incredibly complex, sometimes really tense dance between a country's right to govern itself, national sovereignty, how they manage the digital world, and, well, the basic right to free expression, especially now when we're all so connected. Pretty much every country is wrestling with this, right? How do you handle these giant global tech platforms? Nepal's move here, it's a really stark example. High stakes.
Yeah, and what's truly fascinating here, and this is what we really want to get into today, is that it wasn't just, flicking a switch off. This decision by Nepal, it's got so many more layers than that initial headline you might have seen. Oh, they didn't pay their taxes. That's just not the full story. We're going to peel back those layers, understand exactly why Nepal took such a drastic step so subtly. What were the regulatory gaps they were trying to plug? And importantly, how does what they did stack up against what other countries are doing? Because some things are similar, but critically, some are really quite different. Our mission today really is to understand all those intricate parts of the decision from, yes, the money side, the fiscal policy, all the way through to the huge implications for free speech. And ultimately think about what this situation, as it unfolds, could mean for you, wherever you are, as governments everywhere keep trying to figure out how to deal with the sheer influence of big tech.
Right, so let's paint the picture. September 4th, 2025. Or, if you're using the Nepali calendar, that's Bhadra 19, 2082. That morning, people right across Nepal found their digital landscape had just changed fundamentally. A nationwide ban kicked in, and boom, access cut off to 26 major social media platforms. And we're talking the big ones here, the absolute giant, Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, X, what most of us still call Twitter, all of them, just gone, offline. It was so abrupt, so total, it immediately caused, well, widespread confusion. And obviously a lot of concern for millions of people, because these aren't just time wasters, right? People rely on these platforms for, well, everything. Keep in touch with family abroad, running businesses, getting news.
Absolutely. Critical lifelines for many.
Exactly. So the sheer scale of it, the speed, just pulling the plug on so many services that are so deeply woven into daily life all at once. Yeah. It really caught people off guard, globally too.
And it's really crucial to grasp that this wasn't like a total internet shutdown. It wasn't indiscriminate. It was actually very targeted, very selective, which, immediately makes you ask, okay, how did some platforms manage to comply while these massive ones didn't? So while those 26 big names were blocked, there was this small sort of select group that actually did manage to meet Nepal's new rules by the deadline, which was incredibly tight, by the way.
Oh, really? Which ones?
Yeah, platforms like TikTok, surprisingly perhaps, Viber, WeTalk, Nimbuzz, and another one called Papo Live, they got through. Which tells you something, right? Either about their agility, maybe their willingness to adapt quickly to local rules, or perhaps their structure made it easier. And interestingly, two others, Telegram and Global Diary, they were given what the government called temporary exemptions. Why? Because they were apparently in process. They were actively trying to comply. So that suggests there was a path, maybe a narrow one, but a path to avoid the ban if you showed you were making the effort.
Okay, so not completely inflexible then.
Well, seemingly not for everyone, but for the vast majority, including all of Meta's platforms, Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp, and Google, YouTube, X, Reddit, LinkedIn, the block came down hard and fast. The internet service providers, the ISPs across Nepal, they were ordered to implement these blocks, effectively made them unreachable. So this selective approach, it really underscores the government's strategy here. It wasn't just about some general rule. It felt like it was about bringing specific, very powerful platforms, often the ones dominating online conversations, directly under their control. That precision, that targeting, it signaled right away that this was about something deeper than just a simple policy update.
Okay, so here's where this deep dive starts getting really interesting. Because if you, like me, first heard about this ban, your immediate thought was probably, okay, they weren't paying their taxes. Simple. It's sort of the default assumption, right? Government versus big tech, probably about money. But the truth, well, when you actually look at the official records, the numbers, it tells a very different story, a much more complex one. And honestly, kind of surprising, because it turns out It wasn't that these tech giants were just completely ignoring their financial obligations. Many of them were actually paying up, contributing quite a bit, in fact, to Nepal's treasury. Let's just lay out the facts on the money side. Nepal had actually been pretty proactive here. They set up a clear legal framework for taxing the digital economy way back in their fiscal year 2079-80. That's 2022-23 for most of the world. This framework specifically required these non-resident digital service providers, the big tech companies, to register with their Inland Revenue Department, the IRD. And once registered, they had to pay value-added tax, VAT, and also a 2% digital service tax, DST, on their annual transactions over a certain threshold, about 3 million Nepalese rupees. And here's the key part. They were collecting it.
Right. They were collecting substantial amounts.
Exactly. Look at this. In just the fiscal year 2023-24, 18 companies, and yeah, this list included Meta, Google, TikTok. Together, they paid around 415 million Nepalese rupees in these taxes. That's significant. And even more telling, by September 2025, the very month the ban hit, Nepal had already collected nearly 930 million rupees, that's 93 crore, in DST and VAT combined from these platforms. So the data just flat out shows that major players like Meta and Google were meeting their tax duties. So clearly, this wasn't fundamentally about chasing unpaid bills. It had to be about something else, something more foundational maybe, about control, sovereignty.
Precisely. That fiscal compliance piece is key because it highlights the real issue wasn't the money. As Nepal's government saw it, the problem was a fundamental lack of accountability and, crucially, a lack of local physical presence. The real fight, the flashpoint, was this document, the Directive on Regulating the Use of Social Media, 2080. Now, for listeners, it's maybe useful to know what a directive means here. It's not quite a law passed by Parliament. It's more like a set of detailed, legally binding instructions from a government ministry, in this case, the Ministry of Communications and Information Technology, designed to put broader policies into action. And this directive went way beyond just taxes. It laid out some really strict requirements about how these global platforms had to operate inside Nepal. Let's break down what they demanded, because these points really get to the core of Nepal trying to assert digital control. First, they made it mandatory to appoint a local contact person, physically based in Nepal.
Okay, so not just a mailbox.
Exactly. Not just a name on paper somewhere else. This means someone actually on the ground who can receive legal notices, who falls under Nepali law, who can liaise directly and immediately with the government. Think about a crisis, right? Like dangerous misinformation spreading fast or cybercrime. Without someone local, the government's hands are kind of tied, or at least slowed down considerably. Second, they had to designate a grievance handling officer. Again, local, their job, to specifically deal with user complaints from Nepali citizens quickly, locally. So if you're in Nepal and your account gets hacked, or you're facing harassment or have a content issue, you have a clear, accessible person to go to within Nepal, not some faceless global support system that might take weeks.
That makes sense from a user perspective, actually.
It does. And thirdly, and this one is probably the most critical in terms of content control, the directive required assigning a self-regulation officer. This person's role was to oversee content moderation specifically for Nepal, targeting things the government flagged as problems, misinformation, hate speech, cybercrime, anything seen as a threat to social harmony. This basically put the burden on the platforms themselves to police content according to Nepali standards and laws, not just their own global policies, which might not fit the local context.
Okay, that's a big one. Policing content locally.
Huge. And finally, underpinning all of this, platforms had to ensure mandatory adherence to Nepal's cybersecurity laws and its broader constitutional provisions. That covers everything from data privacy to ensuring content legality under Nepali law. So put it all together, Nepal was essentially saying loud and clear, look, if you want to operate in our digital space, you need a real, tangible presence here. You need to be reachable. You need to follow our rules on our soil. Paying taxes from afar isn't enough anymore. It was a fundamental demand for accountability, the same kind you'd expect from any physical company operating in the country, a real assertion of digital sovereignty.
Wow. That's a completely different picture than just pay your taxes. It shifts from just financial contribution to, respecting our digital borders, our laws. And as you said, this wasn't just dreamed up overnight by the ministry, was it? There was pressure building.
Exactly. The path to actually enforcing this, it wasn't arbitrary. There was significant external pressure, especially from Nepal's Supreme Court. The court had been dealing with these writ petitions, basically, legal challenges against the government for not regulating these platforms effectively, so dating all the way back to 2020.
So this has been brewing for years.
Well, for years. It wasn't a new issue. And finally, in August 2025, the court issued a really decisive order. It basically put enormous judicial weight behind the need for regulation.
And what did the court say, specifically?
It was pretty direct. It ordered the government to strictly enforce these new rules, the ones in the directive, and it explicitly stated that platforms operating without proper registration and oversight, essentially, without meeting these new requirements were, and I quote, illegal.
Illegal. Okay, that's strong language from the highest court.
Very strong. And that judicial mandate gave the government, well, significant legal cover, or at least a powerful justification for cracking down. Government officials, when they spoke about the ban, they kept pointing back to this. They argued, look, taxes are fine, we appreciate the revenue, but it's just not enough. It doesn't guarantee accountability where it matters most. Having someone local to talk to, having a way for users to get issues resolved, and crucially, having some control over problematic content that could cause real social unrest.
And they specifically called out Meta, didn't they?
They did. Officials made a point of claiming that Meta, even though it was paying its taxes, had apparently told the government it wasn't willing or able to comply with these new rules about local representation and content officers. Now, whether that's the full picture of Meta's stance, we don't know for sure, but that's the narrative the government put out. It certainly painted a picture of a standoff. Nepal versus one of the world's biggest tech companies. So ultimately, the government's public position was crystal clear. This ban wasn't primarily about money. The money was coming in. It was about asserting governance, about control over the digital space within Nepal's borders, content, operations, accountability, the whole package.
Right, so given all that context, the official line versus the background, it naturally leads to this really critical question we have to ask. Was this genuinely about protecting users and asserting sovereignty? Or was there maybe something else going on, a more, let's say, calculated political motive, maybe about controlling the narrative, especially with elections coming up?
Yeah, the timing is definitely noticeable. It's very noticeable because despite all the official talk about regulation and directives, there's been this huge wave of criticism arguing that the ban was fundamentally politically motivated. And the timing is Exhibit A for those critics. Nepal has general elections scheduled for 2027. That's 2084 in the Nepali calendar. In any country, especially one with a vibrant, sometimes volatile political scene, any major move to restrict communication channels right before an election, it immediately raises red flags. People worry about controlling debate, suppressing opposition voices, limiting how people organize. So critics are saying, look, maybe this isn't just about digital governance. Maybe it's about shaping the information landscape before people go to the polls.
And that criticism wasn't just coming from inside Nepal, right? The international reaction was pretty swift and pretty negative.
Oh yeah, the global community definitely noticed. And they weren't shy about voicing concerns. Major international news outlets jumped on it immediately, and the tone was often one of alarm. You saw big names like Al Jazeera, Reuters, TechCrunch, even The Hindu over in India, all describing the ban in very similar terms.
How are they framing it?
They were calling it an effort to tighten control over online speech, or more bluntly, to silence dissent. That narrative really took hold internationally very quickly, painting Nepal's move as a worrying step backwards for freedom of expression.
And it wasn't just the news media, I assume. What about rights groups?
Exactly. Those watchdog organizations that focus specifically on press freedom and digital rights, they weighed in very heavily. The Committee to Protect Journalists, the CPJ, and the International Federation of Journalists, the IFJ, they both put out strong condemnations. They called the ban a direct threat to free expression and, significantly, a dangerous precedent for press freedom. And they didn't just make a general statement. They specifically linked it back to Nepal's history, pointing out that journalists have been prosecuted there before under sort of vague electronic transaction laws. So they argued this ban wasn't happening in a vacuum. It fit a pattern that worried them deeply about shrinking space for media and online freedom.
So connecting it to past actions.
Precisely. And even regional coverage, like from the Indian Express or the Hindustan Times, they amplified concerns coming from civil society groups inside Nepal who were protesting. They highlighted these widespread worries about, democratic backsliding. So the international view was largely quite skeptical, leaning heavily towards seeing this as a concerning move on speech, not just regulation. And that skepticism, that disapproval, it wasn't just limited to journalists and international groups. Inside Nepal, and maybe even more vocally among the huge Nepali diaspora communities around the world, Social media itself ironically became this massive echo chamber of criticism. On platforms like X, which was, banned but accessible via VPNs, Nepali users and expats were just scathing. They explicitly called it censorship. Lots of posts directly accused the government of trying to control the public conversation ahead of those 2084 elections, echoing exactly what the international groups were saying.
And they picked up on that point about who got banned too, right?
Absolutely. Many people pointed out the irony, or what they saw as hypocrisy. Platforms like Meta and Google, which were paying millions in taxes, got banned. Meanwhile, some smaller apps, maybe less important for political discussion, they were allowed to stay online. That selective approach really fueled the anger. You saw this huge surge in people recommending VPNs, virtual private networks, basically tools to get around the block. And people were actively tagging international human rights organizations, digital rights groups, trying to draw more global attention, trying to get intervention. Now, it's fair to say this online backlash, while really intense and vocal, was probably most concentrated in urban centers and among the more politically engaged digital users. Whether it fully reached the wider population, especially in rural areas, is harder to gauge immediately, but the sentiment among the connected population was overwhelmingly negative.
Okay, so let's zoom out again. We've seen the specifics in Nepal, the justifications, the criticisms. What does this all mean in the bigger global picture? Because, as we touched on earlier, Nepal isn't alone in struggling with this.
Not at all.
This whole situation, it really reflects this growing trend everywhere. Governments all over the world are trying to figure out how to deal with these massive, powerful, often foreign-based digital platforms. They operate across borders, they shape public opinion, they control huge chunks of online commerce, but getting them to play by local rules, that's tough. And the real tension, the tricky part, is finding that line. Where does legitimate regulation, protecting citizens, stopping crime, ensuring fair taxes stop, and where does a potential repression begin? Stifling free speech, controlling political debate. It's a really fine line.
It's incredibly fine.
Every country seems to be trying to assert some kind of digital sovereignty, trying to make sure their national laws actually apply online, just like they do offline. It really is like this global game of, digital chess. And Nepal, they just made a very, very bold move on that board.
Absolutely. And if we want to understand Nepal's move in context, looking at India is really useful. There are definite parallels in the motivations, even if the methods ended up being quite different. Back in 2021, India brought in its new IT rules. The full name is Intermediary Guidelines and Digital Media Ethics Code. Quite a mouthful. These rules were explicitly designed to bring big tech, especially social media platforms, under much tighter government control. India had similar concerns driving this misinformation, fake news spreading like wildfire, lack of local accountability from these global companies.
Okay, so similar drivers, what did India's rules actually require?
Key things included forcing large platforms to appoint a grievance officer based in India, someone local to handle user complaints within strict time limits. Sound familiar?
Yeah, very similar to Nepal's demand.
Exactly. And another big one. Platforms had to remove content flagged by the authorities within 36 hours, a very tight deadline that immediately sparked huge debates about censorship and the potential for abuse, and the consequences for not complying in India. They were serious, and it led to some very public fights. Twitter, for instance, initially pushed back hard against some of these rules, especially the quick takedown requirement. This resulted in long court battles, huge pressure from the Indian government, and even the threat of making company executives criminally liable if they didn't comply.
Wow, criminal liability.
Yeah. So while India didn't just flip a switch and ban Twitter overnight, the legal and political heat was intense. It was the sustained pressure campaign that eventually forced Twitter and others to largely fall in line. It shows a powerful government getting its way, but using a more legalistic, drawn-out process, maybe giving companies more time to adjust, even if it was under duress, pressure, not an instant block.
Okay, so that's India. What about Europe? They've been quite active in this space too, haven't they? With the DSA.
Oh, absolutely. Europe's approach, the Digital Services Act, the DSA, is arguably the most comprehensive, maybe the most ambitious attempt globally to regulate this space. Unlike India's rules, which felt a bit more reactive to specific problems, the DSA is this massive, proactive framework designed to fundamentally change how large online platforms operate across all 27 EU countries.
So what does the DSA actually do? What are the core ideas?
It imposes really strict, wide-ranging obligations. Things like forcing platforms to be much more aggressive in fighting misinformation and illegal hate speech, making them ensure online safety, especially for kids, protecting consumer rights in online marketplaces. And a huge piece is transparency they have to produce detailed reports about how their algorithms work, how they moderate content, how they handle illegal stuff. It's a massive effort to make the digital world safer and more accountable according to European values and laws.
And the teeth. What happens if they don't comply in Europe?
The teeth are sharp, really sharp. Companies that break the DSA rules can face absolutely massive fines. We're talking up to 6% of their global annual revenue.
6% of global. That's huge money for these companies.
Exactly. For a Meta or a Google, that could easily be billions of dollars. Billions. So it's a massive financial stick designed to force compliance. The idea is to change their behavior through economics, making it incredibly costly not to follow the rules rather than just shutting them down immediately. It's about making them accountable legally and financially within the European system. And then you've got Australia, which took yet another path. Their approach was much more focused on the economics, specifically the relationship between tech platforms and news media. They brought in the News Media Bargaining Code in 2021. This was pretty unique. It essentially created a legal framework that forced platforms, mainly Facebook and Google, to sit down and negotiate payment deals with Australian news organizations for the news content that appeared on their platforms.
Right. The pay-for-news fight.
Exactly. Australia argued these platforms were making huge profits using content created by journalists, but the news outlets themselves were struggling financially. The code was designed to rebalance that power dynamic and get money flowing back to the news creators. And the consequences there were dramatic, very visible. Facebook, in protest, actually pulled all news content off its platform for Australian users for several days, just wiped it clean.
I remember that. It caused chaos.
It did. It was a huge flex of their power. But ultimately, it kind of backfired. There was a massive public outcry, intense government pressure, and Facebook eventually came back to the negotiating table. Deals were struck. It showed that even a company as powerful as Facebook could be forced to negotiate if the regulation was designed effectively and the government held firm. A real test of wills.
Okay, so India, the EU, Australia, all tackling similar problems, but with really different tools.
Yeah.
Legal pressure, massive fines, forced negotiation.
Yeah,
So when you put Nepal's action next to these, it really does stand out, doesn't it?
it really does.
Because while the trend is global, like you said, Nepal's method seems quite different. The EU and India, they tend towards fines, lengthy court cases, regulatory frameworks designed to change behavior over time. Australia used its law to force a commercial deal. But Nepal, faced with non-compliance, they went straight for, well, the nuclear option, you can say. An immediate outright ban on the platforms that didn't meet their demands. It feels much more direct, much faster, maybe less nuanced than what we've seen elsewhere.
I think that's a fair assessment. It reflects a very immediate assertion of control, perhaps born out of frustration, perhaps a strategic choice by a smaller nation trying to make a big statement against global giants. But you're right, it immediately raised that critical question. Is pulling the plug like that actually more effective in the long run? Or does it bring a whole host of other problems, economic damage, social disruption, accusations of censorship that might actually undermine the original goals? These global comparisons really highlight that governments have a whole toolkit available, a spectrum of options. Nepal's decision to jump straight to the ban, it's definitely a significant outlier in how they chose to assert that digital sovereignty. It signals maybe a real sense of urgency, perhaps even desperation to get control.
Right, so we've dug into the why and the what. We've put Nepal's move in that global context. But the question that just keeps hanging there, especially looking at the immediate chaos it caused, is could they have done this differently? Could Nepal have achieved its goals, the legitimate ones, around regulation and accountability without causing such massive disruption, without facing such strong international criticism? Because the argument from the critics, both inside Nepal and globally, seems pretty consistent. The ban felt abrupt, it felt way too broad, the timing was terrible, and ultimately maybe counterproductive. That instead of building trust or getting companies to comply constructively, it just made people more suspicious of the government, hurt the economy, and fueled those authoritarian accusations. Less like smart regulation, more like, well, a sledgehammer.
And when you really dissect the government's approach, step by step, several potential missteps do seem quite clear, and they likely contributed to that negative reaction. First, as we discussed, there was that apparent lack of proportionality and dialogue during the implementation phase. Giving global giants only 7 days to comply with really complex new requirements after the Supreme Court order, that just seems unrealistic. Companies like Meta and Google said as much, setting up local offices, hiring specific personnel, building out new moderation systems. It takes time, planning, legal work. It's not something you can just flip a switch on in a week.
Right, 7 days feels impossibly short for that kind of restructuring.
Exactly. Yet the government was apparently unwilling to budge on that timeline. That inflexibility is what prompted groups like the CPJ to warn about dangerous precedents and plead for a more collaborative regulation approach, maybe a phased rollout. Give companies a realistic chance to adapt, engage in dialogue, instead of just hitting them with an immediate ban. That lack of dialogue seems like a key missed opportunity. Second, there's that question about overreach in how they interpreted the Supreme Court's order. The court focused on stopping unlicensed operations, meaning platforms without proper registration were deemed illegal, but did that explicitly mandate an immediate nationwide shutdown of all services for all non-compliant platforms? Critics, like the media outlet Nepal Views, argued no. They called the cabinet's decision to impose the blanket ban a misuse of judicial authority, suggesting the government took the court order and ran much further with it than was strictly necessary or intended. Perhaps a more transparent process, maybe involving an independent body to interpret and apply the rules, could have avoided that perception of the government just using the court order as a pretext for a sweeping crackdown. Thirdly, and this is a big one, the government seemed almost worryingly disconnected from, or perhaps willing to overlook, the huge, wider economic and social impacts of pulling the plug so suddenly. The disruption wasn't just a minor inconvenience, it hit hard. Think about all those small and medium-sized businesses, the SMEs. They're the engine of Nepal's economy in many ways. So many of them, particularly in areas like handicrafts, tourism, local retail, rely almost entirely on Facebook and Instagram for advertising, for reaching customers, for making sales.
Their entire storefront, essentially.
Precisely. Overnight, their main way of doing business just disappeared. Orders couldn't be taken, customers couldn't be reached. We're talking about people's livelihoods, direct income loss. And that's before you even get into things like disrupting foreign remittances, money sent home from Nepalists working abroad, often coordinated via these platforms, which is absolutely vital for the national economy. And beyond the economy. It hit education, with students relying on YouTube and other platforms for learning resources. It hampered youth activism, which heavily uses platforms like X and Facebook for organizing and sharing information. The Kathmandu Post newspaper summed it up well, warning about confusion, economic fallout, and reputational harm for the country. It really suggests the government maybe didn't fully weigh these massive collateral costs against the regulatory goal. And finally, back to that poor timing, implementing this ban so close to the 2027 general elections, it just made it incredibly easy for critics to frame it as politically motivated. Whether that was the primary intention or not, the timing handed opponents a powerful narrative. The government is trying to silence us, control information before the vote. Social media is a key space for political debate and opposition activity in Nepal. Clamping down right then, it inevitably looked suspicious and allowed the government's actions to be painted as authoritarian, rather than just a necessary, if clumsy, attempt at regulation.
That's a really clear picture of the potential missteps. So, given all that, and thinking back to the global examples we discussed, what were the alternatives? What could Nepal have done instead of this immediate blanket ban? It sounds like there were quite a few options on the table, as groups like the CPJ suggested. I mean, one obvious one is just extended deadlines, right? Instead of 7 days, maybe give them 3 months, 6 months, and actually talk to them during that time, provide clear guidelines, maybe even some technical support.
That's a very standard regulatory approach.
Yeah, the upside seems clear. It builds a bit of goodwill, acknowledges reality, gives companies time. The downside, I guess, is it slows things down, maybe invites delay tactics, but still less confrontational. Or what about phased enforcement? Instead of going straight to a ban, maybe start with official warnings, then maybe levy fines, make them escalate if they still don't comply. You can even get more targeted, like blocking just their ability to sell ads in Nepal, hitting their wallet without cutting off communication for users, or maybe exempting essential services like WhatsApp initially.
Proportionate responses.
Exactly. Proportionality. It feels less disruptive, targets the noncompliance more directly. The challenge there, maybe, is it requires more effort from the government to monitor and enforce over time. And you mentioned incentives earlier. What about incentive-based regulation? Instead of just sticks, maybe some carrots, like offering tax breaks for companies that comply quickly, streamlining the registration, or even partnering with them on things like developing AI tools to fight misinformation in Nepali.
A collaborative model.
Yeah, encourages cooperation, maybe leads to better long-term solutions. But I suppose that really depends on the platforms being willing to play ball, which isn't always guaranteed. And finally, that idea of an independent oversight body, setting up something neutral, maybe like the data protection agencies in Europe, to handle complaints, monitor compliance, publish reports, ensure transparency.
That's often seen as international best practice.
Right. It takes the politics out of it, builds trust. But yeah, setting something like that up takes time, money, legal changes, political will. It's not a quick fix. But still, these options show there was a whole range of possibilities between doing nothing and dropping the hammer immediately.
And what's crucial to underline here, absolutely crucial, is that the Nepali government wasn't acting out of ignorance. They knew how important these platforms were. This wasn't a case of some bureaucrats underestimating Facebook's reach or not realizing people use YouTube for education. They knew. Nepal is incredibly reliant on social media. We're talking massive user numbers, 16.5 million on Facebook alone. That's nearly 90% of internet users. 14.8 million on Messenger, 4.2 million on Instagram, millions using YouTube daily. Even X has a significant user base for news and politics. That 2025 data reportal survey finding 97% of connected adults use social media daily. The government would have known that.
And they knew about the money, too.
Absolutely. They'd collected nearly ₹1 billion in digital taxes from these companies by the time of the ban. They knew the scale of the business. And their own policy documents going back to 2023 show they were already well aware of the risks, misinformation, cybercrime, social harmony issues. They've been flagging these problems themselves. Plus, the fact they did exempt TikTok and Viber, that wasn't accidental. It suggests a calculated move, not a blind panic. So putting it all together, it points very strongly towards this being a deliberate political calculation. They decided to prioritize asserting digital sovereignty and control, even knowing it would cause significant disruption, economic pain, and international backlash. It was a choice, a trade-off they seemed willing to make.
And the immediate results of that choice, that trade-off,
Yeah.
were pretty stark, as you said. Almost instantly, you saw VPN usage skyrocket in Nepal as people scrambled to get back online, which kind of undermines the whole point of the ban, right? And raises questions about how enforceable it really is.
Questions its effectiveness?
And economically, those small businesses, the SMEs relying on Facebook and Instagram ads, they felt the pain immediately. Huge disruptions to their income, their customer base. And socially, politically. You had protests erupting, people accusing the government of becoming authoritarian. Now, sure, there were voices defending the ban, saying it was necessary, tough love for sovereignty, part of a global trend. But the dominant reaction seemed to be one of anger, confusion, and a feeling of being cut off. It really highlights the immediate, complex, and often messy consequences when a government takes such a drastic step in the digital realm. #CheckTag Outro.
So if we try to tie all these threads together, connect it all back to the bigger picture, it's really clear that Nepal's social media ban is so much more than just a fight over taxes or a simple regulatory update. It really is this complex, very layered struggle. It's a digital sovereignty, yes, but also about national governance, how a country manages itself, and ultimately about political power in this digital age we're all living in. The government in Nepal, through this action, they undeniably sent a very strong message. You want to operate here. You play by all our rules. Local presence, grievance officers, content standards, the whole package, not just the financial side. And that message echoes what many nations globally are starting to demand from big tech.
Yeah, but as we spent this time exploring, that really forceful message, while it definitely asserted the government's will, it came at a pretty steep price, didn't it? Accusations of censorship flying in from all corners, real economic pain for businesses and individuals, and a public that, well, showed it could be quite resourceful in finding ways around the ban, which maybe signals a deeper issue of trust and questions the ban's long-term success. It's just such a difficult balance for any country to strike, especially when politics are involved. And thinking about that balance, this whole situation in Nepal, it leaves us with a really important, maybe even provocative question for you, our listener, to think about long after this deep dive ends. In this world where our digital borders, our online spaces are becoming just as critical, just as contested as our physical borders, how do we as citizens of the world, as users of these platforms, make sure that necessary regulation, which is needed, doesn't accidentally slide into becoming repression? And maybe more pointedly, how do governments everywhere, facing these same kinds of pressures and challenges with global tech platforms, manage to strike that incredibly delicate balance? The balance between their legitimate need to assert sovereignty and govern their digital territory, and protecting the fundamental human right to free expression, especially when elections or other politically sensitive moments are on the horizon. Nepal's experience offers a really stark, compelling case study, not just for other governments, but maybe for all of us, as we try to figure out the future of our digital lives.